local development.
Recuerda que si te pierdes algún
Remember
seminario
that if
o
you
quieres
miss one
volver
of
a
the
verlo,
seminars or
lo
you want to
encontrarás en el
watch
canal
it
de
again,
YouTube
you will
del
find it
PIB
in the
y en
YouTube
la
channel
página web
of
de
the
la Red de
IDB
Ciudades.
and on the website of the Cities Network.
Ya estamos listos. Bienvenidos
We are
al
ready to
seminario.
go. Welcome to
Con
the
ustedes,
seminar.
María Camila Uribe,
I give
coordinadora de
you
la Red de
María
Ciudades del
Camila
PIB.
Uribe, coordinator of the IDB Cities Network.
Muy bienvenidos y gracias por
Welcome
acompañarnos hoy en
everyone,
este
and
tercer
thank you
seminario de
for
la
joining
serie
us in this
Ciudades que
third
Innovan,
seminar
nuevas
of
rutas
the
para financiar la
series
La semana
Cities that
pasada tuvimos
Innovate,
un
New
seminario muy
Routes
interesante
for
sobre
Financing
bonos
Resilience.
temáticos,
Last week we had a
donde
very interesting
junto al
seminar
panel de expertos
with
y a
on
las
thematic
observaciones de
bonds
los
and
casos de
with the
Bogotá y
panels
Tokio,
on the different
concluimos que
cases
no
of Bogota
solo
and Tokyo.
hay una forma
We concluded that there is
financiamiento,
not just one
sino que
way
bien estructurados
to
los
finance
proyectos nos permiten
resilience, but
transformar
with
las
very
carteras
well-structured
urbanas
cities, we
en
will
unas
be able to
oportunidades
develop
de inversión
urban
sostenible que
portfolios
son capaces de
into
atraer capital privado,
sustainable investment
diversificar
portfolios
fuentes y visibilizar el
to
impacto.
diversify sources
Pero para
and
que esta
to
conexión funcione,
visibilize
el
impact.
instrumento
But for
también
this
debe
connection
ser
to
creíble.
work, the
El uso de
instruments
los
needs to be
recursos
credible
debe
as
estar
well.
claramente
The use of
definido,
funds
los
needs to be
proyectos
clearly
deben estar
defined, the
elegibles
projects needs
y
to
debe
be
existir
eligible,
una
and there
revisión
has
por
to be
parte
a
de
clear
expertos
review by
que nos ayuden
experts
también a reportar con
to help us
transparencia,
report with
sombra
transparency,
y cuáles
knowledge,
son los
how the
resultados de
projects
ellos.
were financed and what
Y eso
were
nos
the
lleva
results.
directamente al
And
tema de
this
hoy.
takes us to
¿Por
today's
qué es importante
topic.
tener en
Why is it
cuenta
important to
que cuando
take
salimos a
into
buscar
account
capital
that
privado,
when we seek
una ciudad
private
necesita ser
capital,
capaz de
a
generar
city
y de
needs to be
gestionar su
able
propia
to
riqueza?
manage its
Los
own funds,
instrumentos de
its own
gestión del suelo
resources.
son precisamente
Land
eso,
management tools
son
are precisely that,
desde adentro,
a
desde la ciudad.
foundation built
Y
from
hoy
within, from
hablaremos
the
cómo
city.
los
So
gobiernos
today we
locales
will
pueden
discuss how
activar
local
el
governments
mecanismo
can
de desarrollo del
leverage
suelo para
land
generar
management
recursos
tools to
endógenos
generate
y sostener
endogenous
las
resources
inversiones de
and
crecimiento.
support investments in
Para entrar en
resilience.
materia, cuando hablamos de instrumentos de
So get
gestión
right to the
urbana o instrumentos de gestión
point,
del
when we talk about
suelo,
urban
nos
management tools or
referimos a
land management
mecanismos de
tools, we are
política
referring to
pública
public
que
policy
permitan a las
mechanisms
ciudades
that enable
orientar el
cities to
desarrollo
guide
urbano y al
urban
mismo
development
tiempo
while also
capturar parte del valor
capturing a portion of the
generado en
value
decisiones públicas.
generated by public
Por ejemplo,
decisions.
cuando hay
For
cambios en
example,
las
when
normas
there's
urbanas,
regulatory
cuando
changes,
hay inversiones en infraestructura o se
infrastructure
amplían
investments,
los derechos de
or
edificabilidad
increasing
para
in
reinvertirlos en las
building rights
prioridades
and
y las
reinvesting it
necesidades.
in urban priorities.
Pero, ¿por qué es clave esto para la
But
resiliencia
why
urbana?
is this key
Porque en un
to urban
contexto
resilience? Because in a
de
context of
desafíos fiscales,
fiscal
estos instrumentos
constraints,
pueden
these
convertirse
tools can become
también
an
en una
endogenous
fuente
and
de
more stable
riesgo, que
source of
son
funding
estables
for
y que
investments
pueden
that
ayudar a generar
reduce
recursos para
risks
inversiones,
and vulnerabilities
riesgos, vulnerabilidades en distintos proyectos de inversión,
in
desde
different
soluciones basadas en
investment projects, for
naturaleza o
example,
proyectos de
nature-based
vivienda
solutions or housing
o
projects
equipamientos urbanos
or urban
en
equipment
diferentes lugares.
in different
Esta
places.
sesión de hoy
In
tiene
today's
tres cosas.
sessions, we will
Vamos a
do three
presentar
things. We're
un
going
mapa
to
práctico de
present
instrumentos
a
como
practical
contribuciones por
overview
mejoras,
of policy
obligaciones
tools, such
a
as
los
betterment charges,
desarrolladores o cargos por
development
derechos
obligations,
o reajuste en el suelo
or
y el valor
readjustments
del suelo.
in the
Una
value of the
segunda
land.
parte
The second part
donde
is
vamos a
we're going to be
conversar sobre las
discussing
condiciones habilitantes
the conditions, the
para
enabling
implementarlos, los
conditions
marcos
for
normativos,
implementing them,
la
for example, the
capacitación
regulatory
institucional,
framework
la
and institutional
transparencia, la
capacity,
gestión
transparency,
y
and data
lo
management.
tercero,
And
aterrizarlos con
three,
casos
to
concretos de
apply them
ciudades
to
y
real-world
ciudadanos.
examples from cities and
Para
lessons
la sesión
learned
de
from
hoy
implementation.
nos acompaña mi colega
Joining
Camila
us to
Maleronca.
moderate the
Ella es
discussion is my
especialista senior
colleague
de la
Camila
División de
Maleronca.
Vivienda y
She's
Desarrollo
a
Urbano del
senior
PIB.
specialist at the
Ella es
IDB's
arquitecta,
Housing and Urban
brasileña con una
Development
gran
Plan. Camila is a
trayectoria
Brazilian architect
excepcional en gestión
with
del
an
suelo y
exceptional
financiamiento urbano. Fue
track
gerente de
record
servicios
in
técnicos de
land
desempeño y
management and
urbanismo,
urban
empresa
financing.
vinculada a la Secretaría
She
Municipal de
served
Patrimonio
as
Pecuario,
manager of
donde
economic
monitorea
studies at
operaciones
the
urbanas y
Sao
desarrolla
Paulo
estudios
Urbanismo,
de
a
factibilidad
company
y servicios
affiliated with the Sao
urbanísticos.
Paulo
Y
Municipal
lleva más de una
Secretariat of
década
Urban
como
Planning,
investigadora y
when
docente
she monitored
bilingüe
operations and
en
conducted
temas
feasibility
de
studies for
recuperación de
urban development
plusvalías y
projects.
financiamiento del
And she has
desarrollo
spent
urbano.
more than a decade as a
Pocos conocen
researcher
este
at the
tema
Lincoln
tanto
Institute of
adentro
Land
como lo
Policy.
conoce Camila, así que Camila
So few
estará
people know this
moderando
subject
la
from the
sesión de hoy en
inside the way she
portugués
does. So she's going to be
y les
moderating in
recordamos a
Portuguese,
todos
but let
la
me remind
interpretación que
everyone
pueden
that
en
you
el
have
icono de globo
simultaneous interpretation
utilizar el
available
idioma
by
que prefieren.
selecting your language
Pero
on the
entonces,
globe icon on
Camila,
Zoom.
súper
So,
bienvenida y
Camila,
entremos en
welcome.
materia.
So let's just get right
¿Por
to
qué
it. Why,
mayoría de ciudades de
if
América
it's
Latina
most cities in
ya
Latin America
existen
and the Caribbean, there are already land
sistemas y no
management
se activan? ¿Qué
instruments.
pasa? ¿Qué
These are
podemos
not,
hacer para que esto
these are
cambie?
rarely activated or applied. So
Gracias,
what do
María
we need
Mercedes.
in
Un
order
gusto
to
estar
make a
aquí con
change?
ustedes.
Thank
Perdona.
you, Maria
Eu achei que
Mercedes.
eu ia falar em português e eu já
Right,
estava
I was
falando
speaking
brasileiro.
Portuguese,
Então,
yes.
vamos lá. É muito bom estar aqui hoje.
Yes, I will speak in
Falando desse
Portuguese.
tema que
Well,
para mim é
thank you very
tão
much. It's a pleasure to
caro.
be here to discuss
E
this
quando a
issue, which
gente
is
vai falar
a
por
key
que os
issue
instrumentos não
and
são
very clear
implementados ou
for
não são
me, of course,
usados,
when
a
we
gente
want to
volta
discuss
para...
why
Eu acho a
these
melhor
instruments are not
explicação os
applied.
3 Is
I
do
think the best
professor Martinez
explanation
Motta:
is
inércia, ignorância
the explanations of the three
interesse.
I's
Como
of
a gente consegue
inertia, interest, and
desculpa,
ignorance,
inércia é o 4 I.
as I learned in college.
Ideologia, interesse e
Inertia,
ignorância.
well, actually,
Né?
four I's: an ideology,
O interesse e a
ideology,
ideologia a gente consegue
inertia,
deixar num campo
ignorance, and interest. So inertia and
político,
interest,
né?
you could
discurso,
explain this within a
mas a
political
ignorância a
realm,
gente
in a political
consegue
context, as
combater com eventos como
a
esse,
competition of
de
forces. But
disseminação de
ignorance, we can combat
conhecimento,
ignorance
tanto em
with
termos
events such as this
conceituais
one,
como em
when we try to
termos
disseminate knowledge,
práticos, né?
both in
Muitas
conceptual
cidades
terms, but also in
implementam
practical terms. So there are many
políticas
cities
que são
that
políticas de
implement
reativação da
policies
valorização urbana
that
que
are
não são nomeadas como tal.
value
Então, eu
recovery
acho que aqui é
projects
uma
of
chance da
urban land,
gente
which are not really
conversar, trocar
indicated
ideia
in this way. So
e avançar na
I think
construção
this is a good
desse
idea to
conhecimento,
move forward
né?
in the construction of this
Hoje,
knowledge.
quem a gente tem aqui para entender melhor quais são as nossas opções e o que a gente
So
já
what
tem
do we have
de experiência
here
e evidência no
to
mercado de
understand our
uso
options
dos
and
instrumentos na região e no mundo?
the
A
panel
gente
that we
vai
have based
primeiro
on
ouvir 2
the
especialistas,
experience
muita
of these
experiência em
instruments in
temas
other
que
regions of the world.
compartilham
For
uma
first,
mídia colega de
we're going to
longa
be
data do
listening
vínculo,
to two
que vai falar
specialists,
da perspectiva argentina e latino-americana,
uh,
e
Cynthia
a Mindy Kim,
Goitia,
que
which is
traz
going to be
uma
discussing from the
análise
Argentine perspective,
comparada,
and
né,
Minji
em
Kim,
nível
who
global.
will be presenting
Na
a
sequência, a gente vai
comparative
ouvir
analysis
diretamente de
at
Belo
global
Horizonte e
level.
Luján de Cuyo, 2 cidades que vêm
And
utilizando
then we're going
instrumentos
to
de
be
gestão da
listening
valorização urbana,
to, or from the case
com
of Belo Horizonte,
características
which is a city who
peculiares,
has
né,
been
adaptadas
using this
à realidade, às
urban
necessidades de cada município. Isso é
creation of value
fato
based
que
on
a
the
gente
realities
observa
of
muito que não
municipalities.
existe de
And this is
forma
a fact that
mágica,
we
né?
observed a lot.
Existe
And this is something that
leque de
doesn't happen by
instrumentos que
magic. This is,
cada município, cada localidade
there
usa
is a
e
whole
dispõe
array
desses
of
instrumentos
instruments
dentro
that each
dos seus próprios
municipality can
recursos.
use
Para a audiência, a
as
gente vai
part of
lembrar
their
os
or
momentos
within
do
their own
seminário, vocês podem
context.
fazer suas
So
perguntas usando
for the
o
audience, I would like to
botão de
remind you that during the
perguntas do
seminar,
Zoom, que
you
está
can ask
nesse
questions by
QA, né,
using the
Q&A.
Q&A function on Zoom.
E sempre, por favor, não esqueçam de indicar para quem é dirigida a
And
pergunta
please
e a ideia é que nossos panelistas
remember
possam
to
responder em
write
tempo
who
real
you are
na
addressing
mesma
the
sessão
question
de
to.
Q&A.
The idea is for our
Então,
presenters to actually answer on the chat on real
obrigada a
time
todos
during the
pela
session.
Súper,
presença.
Camila.
Vamos
Yo
lá,
creo que
Maria Camila.
Thank
antes
you.
de
Thank you
que
very much,
arranquemos
Camila.
con el
So
panel,
before we kick off
siempre
with the
queremos
panel
escuchar a nuestra
itself,
audiencia.
we always like to hear from our
Tenemos
audience, of course.
participantes
We
de todos
have
los países de América
participants from
Latina y el
all the
Caribe y
countries
bueno, y a veces
in
también de otras
Latin America
regiones.
and the Caribbean and from the region
Vamos
as
a
well.
invitarlos a escanear este
So
QR
we would
code
like to
o
invite you
acceder
to
el
scan the
enlace que
QR
les estamos
code that you
enviando
see on
por
the
el chat
screen, or
para
just access the
participar en el
link that we're
Mentimeter.
sending through the chat so you can
Demos unos
participate in
segunditos
the
para que
Mentimeter.
entren,
Let's
escaneen
just
o
give
le
the
den
audience a few
clic
seconds
a la,
for them to
le
scan
clic
the QR
al
code
link que
or
estamos
click
compartiendo
on the
para invitarlos a participar y
link that we are
poderlos
sharing.
escuchar
Just to invite you
a
to
todas las
participate so
personas
you
que hoy
can
nos
hear all
acompañan.
the
Es súper
opinions.
importante para nosotros porque
It's very
aquí
important
también
for us
aprendemos.
because we are also learning
Y
from
creo que
you.
vamos entonces a la primera
So
pregunta.
I think we can move on to the next
Recuerden que el
question.
link está en el chat.
Remember, the link is on the
¿Qué
chat.
es
We
lo que
have just
más
shared
limita
it.
su ciudad
So what is
para utilizar
the
instrumentos de gestión
biggest
del
limitation
suelo
for your
en
city
los proyectos
for
de
using
resiliente?
land
¿Qué es
management
cuáles creen
instruments in
ustedes que son
resilience
o cuál
projects?
creen que es la
What do
principal
you think is the
barrera
main barrier,
o limitación de su ciudad para usar
limitation, or
esos
obstacle
proyectos?
for your city in using land management instruments in resilience projects?
Camila, está el tema del desconocimiento como algo muy
Camila,
importante en
lack
esta.
of knowledge It's one of the main ones. Yeah.
Lo veo.
Así que creo que va a ser muy útil esta
So
conversación.
I think this conversation is going to be very useful.
Wow. Bueno, vamos entonces a la segunda,
So let's move on to the second
donde
one,
lo que
where
queremos que nos cuenten es
basically
cuáles
what
de
we
estos
want to
instrumentos de
see
gestión del
is
suelo
basically
se
which
han
of these
utilizado en su
instruments of
ciudad.
land management
Entonces aquí hay
instruments
varias
have you
alternativas, las voy a
used
leer para los que
in
no
your
alcancen a
city?
ver bien la pantalla.
So I'm going to read
La
it
primera
in
es
case you
contribuciones
can't
constructores o
read the screen
valorización.
very
La
well.
segunda o la
The
B,
first one is
obligaciones al
contributions,
desarrollador para
or
las ciudades
betterment
urbanísticas.
levies,
La
basically.
C, cargos por
Second is
derechos de construcción o
developer
de titularidad,
obligations.
concesión onerosa de
Number
trazabilidad.
3
La D,
is
reajuste del suelo.
building rights
La E,
charges.
gestión estratégica del
Then
suelo
we have
público y de los bancos de
land
suelo. La
readjustments.
F,
Then
acuerdos
public
o
land
convenios
management.
urbanísticos
Then
público-privados.
we have
Y G,
property
impuestos directos.
tax.
¿Cuál
So,
de
which
todas
of these
estas es la que más
instruments
se
of
usa en
land
su ciudad?
management industries have your city implemented or have used in the past?
Siguen llegando punticos, van creciendo las nubes.
Súper
We
interesante. Se
see
ve que
many
falta
people
muchísimo más de lo que
expressing their
ustedes
opinion.
dicen. Me
So, well,
llama la
we see
atención estos
actually a very
detalles
broad
que
application,
hacen tantos
especially
detalles.
the developer obligations. It's actually a surprise for me.
Bueno, Camila, pues creo que con este
Well,
diagnóstico
Camila,
en vivo
with
de la
this sort
audiencia,
of live
por
diagnosis
favor,
from the audience,
el piso es tuyo para
the floor is yours
liderar nuestra conversación de hoy. Gracias.
to moderate today's
Obrigada, Camila.
conversation. Thank
Vamos
you,
lá.
Camila.
Antes da gente entrar no tema, né? O que que a gente precisa
So, let's
sempre
get
lembrar
right to it.
é que
So
a gente
basically,
tem no solo urbano uma
these are issues
fonte
that we need to be
importantíssima
reminded
de
of
recursos públicos. E
always.
muitas vezes
So,
esses recursos são
on the land,
meio
we
que
have infinite
negligenciados.
resources,
Então,
public
cada vez que uma
resources. And
cidade
sometimes these are neglected
faz um
or
investimento
ignored.
público
Every
ou
time a
muda a
city
regulação urbanística,
makes
né?
a
São as
public
nossas duas principais
investment or
fontes de valorização
changes
urbana.
city planning regulations, which
Está
are
gerando
our main
valor, está mobilizando
sources of
valor dentro da
regulation,
cidade. E
it's actually
se a
generating
cidade
value or
não age
mobilizing
pelas
value within the
instrumentos, a gente
city.
tem aí
And
uma gama
if the
deles,
city
né?
does not
O imposto
cooperate
predial, que
with
foi
the
um dos primeiros que eu
instruments
acho que vai
that we
aparecer
just
mais,
saw,
mas
there's
muitas
a
outras
wide array
obrigações
of instruments, for
urbanísticas
example, property
e
tax,
cobrança de
but
estabilidade também
city
está aqui
planning levies or
com bastante relevância.
and betterment
São instrumentos que
charges,
permitem que a gente
also very
devolva para
important.
o público
So these are
essa
instruments that
valorização gerada pela ação pública.
allows us to
São
return to the
esses
public this
mecanismos
value that has been
que a gente
generated by
vai
public action. So
falar
these are mechanisms
hoje
that we're going to be
nessa
discussing
conversa. A gente
today
fala mais uma
in this
vez as
seminar.
perguntas, eu já vi que tem umas perguntas já aparecendo
So
aqui
again, let
no
me
nosso
remind you
chat.
that
Fiquem
we
à
have a
vontade durante toda a sessão
Q&A
para
box.
mandar
People's
suas
already using
perguntas e a
it.
gente vai responder em tempo
You can send
Para
your
começar,
questions and we will
falando
try
do
to
mapa
answer
de
them in real
instrumentos e das
time. So to
condições que
start,
determinam a sua viabilidade de aplicação,
so
eu
to
vou dar a
talk about the
palavra para a
conditions
professora
for
Cíntia Goitia, que
feasibility
é
of these
diretora
instruments,
do
let's give the
mestrado
floor
em
to
Economia
Cynthia
Urbana
Goitia,
do Centro de
which is
Investigação em Políticas
a
Urbanas
professor at the master's
e
degree
Habitação da
for urban
Universidade
policy
dela, na
in
Argentina,
IDB
e
for housing.
docente na Universidade de Harvard. É uma das vozes mais reconhecidas em economia urbana e
And
mercados de solo na
she
América
holds
Latina.
a
E sua
PhD from
pesquisa
Harvard
explica com
University.
precisão
So
por que os
one of the
instrumentos
main
previstos
experts
nos mapas
in
normativos da região
urban
seguem
management.
sendo tão pouco
And she
usados.
will
E quais são
explaining
as condições
why
institucionais, técnicas e
these
políticas
instruments are not
que
really widely
determinam
used
que
and what are
uma cidade pode ou não adotar.
the
Bem-vinda,
conditions for a
Cíntia.
city.
Vamos lá, você
Welcome,
tem
Cynthia.
a palavra.
Let's start with
É
you.
prazer estar aqui com você.
You have the floor. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Muchas gracias por la presentación. Para mí también es un placer
Thank you very
poder
much
estar
for the
acá.
presentation.
Yo
For me, it's
preparé
a
una
pleasure to be here
presentación que de alguna
connected.
manera
I prepared a
trata de
presentation that in one way or
responder
another
todas las
tries to
preguntas que me
answer
fueron,
all the
que
questions
me
that were
pidieron que
given to
responda,
me.
así que voy a compartirla ahora y espero que se
So
vea,
I'm going to share it now,
bien.
and I hope that you can see them well.
Y vamos
And
entonces
we are
con
going to go
mi
ahead and get
presentación de
started
instrumentos de
with my
gestión del suelo.
presentation about
El
land
encuadre
management
general
instruments.
tiene que ver
So
con algo que
the
ya
general
María
framework
Camila
has to do with Maria Camila
empezó a
talked about,
explicar, ¿no? En
and
América
she started to
Latina
explain in Latin
tenemos una
America,
demanda muy
we have
importante
a
de
very
creciente de
important
inversión
demand and
urbana
ever-growing demand
y
of
que
urban agglomerations, and obviously is basically it became more important because of the climate agenda that we have, mitigation instruments that require other type of public investment. And what we see is that there's a fiscal space that keeps contracting itself. We see it gets smaller and smaller, and obviously a very strong decentralization process in countries, for example, we come from Argentina, where a lot of responsibilities are transferred without having all the necessary resources. So on the other side, so it's in most of the cities, so it's a constant flow that is really there's a huge difficulty and little margin to be able to increase a couple taxes. So as Camila mentioned, where do we find this source of income, of our own local income that can be sustainable over time? And that's where we have and obviously collecting from the official subset in cities, you are sitting on an economic base that may be of really important income in soil. Every time that people invest in infrastructure or every time that they change the regulations, we are adding value, and that value can be cut precisely to be able for it to be invested or reinvested in the funding and of urban development. And this is really important because otherwise governments are losing a lot of opportunities, the resources are finite, and if we don't catch part of that evaluation that we are making, we run out of resources to keep funding all the infrastructural demands and development that we have in the city. So the challenge is how to activate the use of these instruments. And as we know, in many countries in Latin America, they have a national regulation that sets the basis for all this menu of instruments that can be implemented. So that we're all clear. Do you see this color map? Every time that a local mayor's office change a resource here or color here, or for example, construction potential, every time they change the use of urban soil, they're adding value, and that added value is the ones that we can say that can be caught to fund that development. Same thing that when they invest in infrastructure, green spaces, etc. All of that adds a valuation in the cities. So this is really important to know. So what are the determining factors of this appraisal? There's evaluation. For example, everything that has to do with regulatory modifications, change of soil use or land use, coefficient increase of edificability, drainage, sewage. Many cities in America that are studying or implementing, for example, VERDT, et cetera, et cetera. Everything, all of that will be from the implementation of this type of instruments. So the first question that they asked me is, why don't you explain the gap between the regulation and practice? And what conditions enable us to overcome them? So if the instruments are in the regulations, why people don't use them? And Camila defined it really well. One of the first issues is knowledge, and you said so yourselves. There's a symmetry of information. Both technicians and decision makers don't know how to apply these instruments or the instruments that they can use. Actually, I have been a professor for many, many years of a lot of officials of the city that from interiorizing themselves and how these instruments work, they start duplicating them in the communities that they work for. And by not knowing these instruments or what they do with instruments, they don't have the knowledge of the potential that the cities may have. If the potential that, for example, the regulation has every time that a new plan is created in adding value within the real estate market. The second one is status quo or institutional inertia. Transfers from upper levels of government that many times really reduced. Sometimes I love to say, for example, that they receive transfers from one government, from governments that allow them to go 10 blocks. But if I'd applied a contribution per improvements, they could take asphalt to every person that needs it. So obviously, many times like a capacity, there are cities that have the best trained teams in all these issues, and in some issues that start to become important for the capacities that are needed from the application of these instruments. Obviously, that becomes more and more complex as the instruments become more complex. But we need to have an updated cadaster, register, appraisals, and a series of continuity of the technical teams. And on the other hand, the design of the instrument. The instrument is not an isolated thing. The instrument has to do with, it has to be clearly bound to a project, linked to a project, to a plan. It's one of the elements of a plan, for example. And it has to have, as we're going to see later on, and a specific allocation of these resources, so things can be much more transparent. And obviously, these things are solved. Obviously, for Excel, there are bias of perceptions, taxes, etc., and that many times has an influence, for example, ideology, etc. So enabling conditions for successful cases, a clear regulatory framework to be politically sustainable. Simple, but politically sustainable. On the other hand, systemic capacity as well. Systemic capacity. I think we lost our presenter. Cynthia, are you there?
Parece que a gente perdeu a Cíntia, não?
Enrique,
I think we lost. I'm coming back. Okay, there I am. I'm back. Okay, I'm gonna share again. Give me just a minute.
Segundos, por favor.
Give us a couple seconds, please.
Estoy encontrando ahora cómo compartir la presentación.
tal vez unos segundos le pedimos al equipo técnico del BID que nos ayude, por favor.
Sí, por favor.
Cintia no puede compartir.
We asked the technical team from the IDB to please help us, help Cynthia actually, to share her presentation. Cynthia, in the meantime, while we continue, can you keep speaking without the presentation? And then we'll put the presentation up so everyone can have it. But oh, there it is. Actually, I think I will keep telling you about it without the presentation. Oh, there it is. So the idea is basically what are the conditions for a successful case, and basically is the capacity of a clear regulatory framework, the technical capacity of appraisal or assessment, transparency in the application and calculation of resources, the specific effects of these resources and aligning and the integration with the urban development strategy and obviously alignment between public and private interests. So the question that comes to mind is, where do we start? Can a city that just started exploring these tools do it? Yes, of course they can. And actually, from that point of view, we have two axes of decision: the technical complexity of the instrument, and the other one, the dynamic of the real estate market. And to this end, I could tell you that the contribution per improvement or is an instrument that every city has in Latin America within their regulatory framework, and it's an instrument that the technical complexity is low, and especially today with all the progress in the or advances in technology, does it require a very important real estate market dynamics, because at the end of the day, certain type of investments respond to the demands of the population, and the population to whom you're providing them with an identifiable benefit. We all know what this contribution per improvement is, or contribution per appreciation. Another point that could be brought in, which is a mid-level complexity, are obligations, and there are other elements, for example, like this or exactions, et cetera, and also the right of sales or CPACs or OODCs for an active market, which monetizes additional edifications. And because in reality, what it does is to monetize that additional edifications that are affected by the regulation. And just to move on, I had a slide ready, or biddability or biddable area. I was going to show you the 5 instruments, but when you see my presentation, you will be able to see it, how they're applied and when they are applied. But let's move on where to start. So, implementing all the menu of instruments without an institutional basis, nor a market that each one needs, may be or may cause problems. So let's start with contributions for improvements, exactions with more dynamic mobility of additional rights. So the third question, to be able to finish on time, is instruments. You have 2 minutes left. I'm going to finish perfect. There's tension between the tax objectives and resilience. Yes, they're really important. So there's not only not tension, but it's reinforced mutually in our objectives when the instrument is well designed. So what do I mean by this? Well, basically, because there are 3 really important elements that support this convergence. The first one is that convergence capitalizes and adds value. Basically, what resilience is doing is creating and adding value. So basically, this prevention and investments of resilience that this prevention work does substitutes the ex-post response that many times is much more costly. If we, for example, do a control problem, etc., for example, for a solution based in nature or whatever, we are anticipating or mitigating all these problems that may happen. So these tools, basically what they do is to align local fiscal laws, climate funding, etc., and sustaining this convergence. So there are examples, yes. For example, I could say, I'm going to give you an example of the city of Buenos Aires. Buenos Aires invested in adaptation for climate and flooding, and that added value financially because it allowed areas that before were floodable and that could not, for example, where they couldn't develop, for example, high types of densities, etc. They were not attractive for development of any type of real estate projects, to start from its the risk of flooding that obviously gave us new developments in general lines. For example, we've done a study, and what we've done is that the appraisal or that it generated, or the valuation or appreciation, obviously would allow And we obviously, for example, the creates improvement in everything has to do with temperature reduction, but at the same time, it appraises or it adds the value of the territories for infrastructure and for road infrastructure. So basically, the investment in resilience is far from being reduced costs, because some public officials say that we have no money. We're investing in something that many times is not seen. Far from that, from a sunken cost creates a fiscal asset that can help deeply its funding. So with this, I finish up my first part, and I'm sorry for the technical difficulties.
Tranquilo,
Apologies.
Cíntia, muito obrigada.
No
Super
problem, Cynthia.
interessante a
Thank you very much.
apresentação, assim
Really
como a Ana.
interesting
E eu acho que eu
presentation.
pego o gancho desse
And thank you for
começo
this
onde
general
você
overview
terminou,
that you have
que
given
é
us.
a
And now
evidência
we are going to start where you
grita,
finished.
né? Salta aos olhos
The
os montantes, os
incidents
valores
and
mobilizados por intervenções urbanas em
all
geral
the
e por
values that are
intervenções em
moved through
resiliência
urban interventions
especificamente.
create a
Então, temos aí
huge
uma
value interventions in
oportunidade,
resilience
ou
specifically.
muitas
And
oportunidades que
we
estão
have a
sendo
huge
perdidas,
opportunity, a
né?
lot of
Eu queria
opportunities, to be
reforçar o
honest, that
pedido
are
para
being
quem está
lost. I
escrevendo
wanted to reinforce a request
chat,
for everyone that's
na
writing
seção de
here
perguntas e
on the
respostas,
chat.
por favor, indicar para quem vai direcionar
In the Q&A
a
session,
sua pergunta, para a gente poder
please
ir distribuindo e
say
seguindo
who
as
you're
respostas.
asking the question to,
Eu vou sair do
so
script
that we can
rapidamente
start
para responder
grouping
algumas perguntas que já apareceram
the
aqui,
answers.
dizendo
So to answer
as
some of the
pessoas
questions that are
já
already
estão
here,
pagando. O que a gente não paga
people
por
are
os
already
instrumentos de recuperação de
people are already
valorização
paying. We're paying
urbana,
with
a
these
gente está
instruments of
pagando
operations of
em
appraisal.
preço de
We
aluguel,
are paying
em
them.
preço de
We're paying
habitação,
them in rental
tá pagando para
prices,
viver na cidade.
rotational
Então,
prices.
é um recurso que está sendo direcionado a proprietários de terreno, não
So
é
it's a
uma carga
resource
adicional. Quando a gente fala
that is
dessa
being
mídia
addressed
de
to
instrumentos,
owners.
seja
It's not a
desde
dish
pequeno
capsule. When we talk about this instrument,
até os mais sofisticados, né?
from the PTU
A outorga, o
up
PAC,
until
o
the most
reajuste,
sophisticated costs,
são instrumentos que eles entram por baixo
when
dessa
they
conta e é uma
create this,
recuperação
they're
da valorização
here
gerada
under
pelo
that
poder público,
account.
não é um novo imposto, como
And it's
dissesse.
an item.
Bom, Cíntia, fica à vontade para olhar as perguntas que estão no chat. Já chegaram perguntas para vocês, para você. Então,
if you have any
você
questions
tem aí sua lição de casa.
that
E
we are
eu vou
here.
passar da
So
realidade latino-americana,
now we're going to do the
ampliar
floor
pouco
of
essa nossa
reality,
visão mais
of the Latin
além
American reality, to broaden our
uma
vision
visão internacional.
besides the region,
Eu
to
apresento
have an
agora
international vision.
a Mindy Quinho,
So
que é
that
professora
said,
assistente do Departamento
Cynthia
de Planejamento
perspective,
Urbano
we're going to see Latin American reality. What I'd like to next is what happens when we look at the region. Now we introduce you to Meiji Kim. Kim is an assistant professor in the Department of Urban Planning at the UCLA Law School of Public Affairs. Her research examines how developer obligations and land value capture mechanisms function in different institutional contexts, and what makes an instrument replicable across vastly different contexts. Minji, welcome. So now we ask you, from an international comparative perspective, what are other cities doing? What are other cities doing to explicitly link these instruments to urban resilience and adaptation goals? What lessons can be transferable to Latin America? So thank you very much, Minji, and the floor is all yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Camila, for that introduction, and Cynthia for providing that broad overview for conditions that would allow for land value capture or land management tools. So I am going to start share my screen, and I'd be happy to. I'm excited that I'll be able to answer some of the questions that Camila posed, and then I'm sure we'll get to the rest through Q&A. And where I wanted to start, and I'll just briefly introduce myself again. So, as Camila mentioned, I am an assistant professor at UCLA's Urban Planning Department, and I have degrees in planning from MIT. My research interest has always been at this intersection of real estate development and urban planning, and by that measure, I've worked with closely with the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, as is Camila, in promoting and exploring land-based financing mechanism for financing, various types of urban infrastructure projects. My research papers in the past and case studies have really focused on how local governments use their land use regulation power to increase and capture value for the public good. And I have a couple case studies through the Lincoln Institute on land value, this particular mechanism, one about water districts in Texas, and then the other one about Boston's urban resiliency infrastructure fund, which is the case that I'll be briefly talking about today. Given the interest of time, that will be the only case that I'll be discussing in detail, but again, more than happy to share resources if anyone's interested. One thing that I want to ask for any of the participants who want to ask me questions, I would very much appreciate it if you can ask me in English, because I don't think I see the English versions of the questions. So I'll start us off by just getting everyone on the same page. I mean, I was very surprised by the intensity or your familiarity with existing land-based financing tools when we were doing the Mentimeter. So I'm pretty confident that, and by the way, I was very surprised that property tax was one of the most, in addition to developer obligations, one of the most common tools used form of land-based financing, which is not what you find in the U.S., where there's incredible limitations both at the state and the state level. In terms of how the ability of local governments to leverage property taxes and do property tax reform. So that was interesting. But again, to go back to where I was starting, land-based financing is this concept, as Camila and Cynthia have laid out, that it is the concept that public investments and other government conduct can increase value, and therefore some of that value increment should be recouped for the public benefit rather than solely benefiting the landowner. That's the core concept that we're talking about. And the most intuitive example being highways, right? If rural land becomes accessible and accessible for real estate development, residential development, then the land is more valuable than what it would have been if it had just remained rural and agricultural. So I wanted to pose this for family of land-based financing tools. This is not the only way that you could categorize, compartmentalize the land-based financing tools, but I like to see it this way so that I understand, which, sort of the whole picture. And also the other point that I want to make is that you might be very surprised that the land-based, you are already very familiar with all of or most of these land-based financing tools, and that they might have different names and different contexts in different countries. But again, getting that global perspective, the core mechanics of these tools are pretty common across the different international contexts. So again, you have property tax-based financing tools. You have user fee type of financing tools, often called as infrastructure levy or developer obligations, the terms that you might be more familiar with. And then you have land use regulatory measures like increasing density, incentive zoning, charging for development rights, and then negotiating developments on a project-by-project basis. And then finally, you have tools that are leveraging existing publicly owned assets. The other point that I want to make with this slide is that it is important to understand that these tools are not mutually exclusive, and that in practice they're oftentimes used in combination. So, and depending on the application. And the other point that I want to make is that some of these tools create value only, some of these tools capture value only, and then some of these tools can do both creation and capture. So it's important, again, as public officials and considering using land value-based financing to understand where the creation lies, and then where the capture lies, and how to combine the two effectively. Especially the last two categories go hand in hand often when the public sector is leveraging publicly owned land. The public sector has also the ability to increase density or provide other regulatory incentives to further increase the value of land and then capture value. So, and this is the example that I will be discussing in the next two slide decks, and that's the Boston's case. But again, this is just one example of the application of land-based financing tool in the US context. All right, so the case study this is in Boston. So as you know, Boston is a thriving North American city. And this particular Raymond Flynn Marine Industrial Park is a 190 acres of industrial land that's owned by the city. It was originally created to preserve urban industrial base and to preserve blue collar jobs. This industrial park is 190 acres, is located in a neighborhood that's called the South Boston neighborhood, or the Waterfront District. It's now in one of the most bustling neighborhood in the city. The South Boston Waterfront District, or some of you might be familiar with the name Innovation District. That was the term that was used in the 1910s to refer to this district under previous Mayor Menino. And this district has gone through tremendous amount and pace, experienced tremendous amount and pace of growth, like real estate growth. And that was particularly it took off in the late 2000s, but really accelerated in the 2010s. So for example, just within 3 years, between 2010 and 2013, the district saw over 10 million square footage of real estate development happening in this particular neighborhood. So at the very end of this waterfront district is the industrial park. So you have a very bustling commercial mixed-use residential neighborhood that's popping up, and then there's the industrial park. So the city recognized the demand for office, demand for residential need in this district, and really decided to take advantage of that real estate demand. So to put this into context of the urban resiliency challenge, this district is the entire waterfront district is sitting on an infill site that was created in the 19th century. So it is one of the neighborhoods facing the greatest exposure and potential losses to coastal flooding. So the city realized that, in order to take advantage and leverage the real estate market, they needed to think about how to flood-proof the district given the sea level rise and increasing flooding risks. So in 2015, they did an initial study, and then 2018 updated with a more precise estimation of how much it would take for flood-proofing the district, and the estimated cost in 2018 was already 200.
Sorry, you have 2 minutes left.
All right, okay. $228 million. So how do we finance this? The solution that the city of Boston came up with was the Climate Resiliency Infrastructure Contribution Program. So remind you that this almost entirety of the 190 acres is owned by the city. So the idea is that the city would lease the land to real estate developers and enter into a deed restriction or contract where the owners of the buildings will contribute to the $228 million that's needed to flood-proof the district, with the rationale being that they will benefit from this infrastructure improvement and therefore should pay for this cost. There were several key policy innovations that were critical for establishing this program. So first of all, the City of Boston increased development capacity to maximize the value that they're creating. Second, most importantly, this program is designed as a reimbursement mechanism, which was the key for getting developers on board. That the idea is that the city will start spending money first, and only when that happens, developers will be asked to reimburse. The other key policy innovation was that in order to prevent free rider program, the agreement says that unless there's 50% of agreement of all square footages in the area, developers are not obligated to pay this fee. The payment is also projected to occur over 30 years. And then there's also a cap on annual payments. So these are all of the mechanisms that the city used to get stakeholder buy-in. And they are considering possibly bond financing the infrastructure using this 30-year payment as a revenue source. And here's the basic idea is that the developers will pay their pro rata or fair share of the benefit that will be created from the city's investment. So that's all I have for now, and I'd be more than happy to answer any questions or share any additional case studies. Thank you.
Obrigada, Mindy, pela apresentação. Eu vou reiterar.
Thank you very much. So let me reiterate for everyone who is posting the questions on the chat, please mention who the question is addressed to. And specifically, these questions should be preferably written in English, especially if the question is for Minji. So I would like to wrap up this part of the webinar with a general questions. Some of the questions have already been answered. So is there there's a paradox on the value that is being generated with planning.
Pega o fio para responder essa e uma pergunta geral.
So if there's some additional questions or Cynthia, or for both presenters actually, basically they're asking for further reflection on urban policy that could be used as an instrument, as Minji was mentioning, as a combination of instruments, as an ally to promote resilience at urban level. It's just an open general questions about, and let me just give the floor to Cynthia first. Well, I think there are three issues that we can highlight. One is the specific impact on resources through trust funds with a very specifically described purpose. And we can find this in many cities in Latin America. The distribution rule is not easily changed because it's already institutionalized in the instrument itself. So we have an instrument designed to finance a specific project or resilience actions. And in that case, it is institutionalized in the regulation itself. So that instrument also, it's a long-term urban program with specific rules. So the project is not really, or the demand, the agenda does not really depend on a specific government or a climate issue, but there is a technical mandate, a documented mandate for this issue. And the third issue is transparency in accountability, public tax collection records. So if all these elements are present, then the political cost of dismantling this sort of instruments that can generate funds to finance priority climate projects are more accepted. So that way I conclude. But I think, yes, these are three very important issues. Thank you, Cynthia. Minji?
Great. So I guess, Camila, can you rephrase the question for me a little?
Of course. I asked how the adoption of a policy, a land value capture policy, can be an ally in promoting resilience in our cities.
I see. So one thing that that really struck me as I was doing the Boston case study was that the feedback that I heard from the experience that the city officials had was developers were actually very much on board because their financiers, the banks, wouldn't finance their project if there isn't a resiliency solution to combat, climate risks. So developers were already, inclined to contribute to this program because otherwise they can't get their projects financed. So in terms of enabling land management tools for financing urban resiliency, I would encourage the participants of this webinar to find that common ground with the private sector and then also share the risks and benefits together, and that would really create that synergy that will enable a successful program.
Super interessante, muito obrigada. Eu acho que
Very
também,
interesting, thank you. Yes, I think we also have a special link for each of the cases and experiences. We have public policy on one side. So we need to find, as you said, common ground. I think that's a good starting point where public interest and private interest can actually reconcile.
Pulo do gato aqui para, não sei como os tradutores vão traduzir pulo do gato, mas a nossa chave para
with our purposes or our common ground or common goal to move forward in the implementation of these programs. I think Belo Horizonte in Brazil, they have a very interesting case. In 2019, the city included different instruments for urban added value program. One of them is an urban planning agreement that recognizes the urban developer as an ally for public policy, for housing policy and for urban policy in general. So the key here when we speak about this urban policy as an inclusion mechanism for many issues, even water supply and sanitation, as we will see in the case study. And this has also had an international scope. So the presentation will explain a program that is being developed with the bank, with the IDB, with our Housing and Urban Development program or division. So I will give the floor to Leonardo, who is the Director of Urban Zoning. He was already Director of Urban Planning.
Foi diretor de desenvolvimento na São Paulo Urbanismo, especialista em PPPs e concessões de infraestrutura.
He is a specialist in infrastructure and housing before he moved back to the Secretariat for Urban Policy in 2005. So he's leading right now the implementation on the urban policy of Belo Horizonte and all the instruments that we just described in the overview. So we will discuss that specific case. Welcome. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Camila. I would like to thank you all. I would like to thank you for the opportunity to participate in such an important that brought to our attention really important background about this presentation. First, my presentation here in Belo Horizonte and what we've acquired in terms of urban instruments. So we have a presentation that's a little bit less inspirational. It's more analytical and everything has to do with the results of urban politics, urban policies in Belo Horizonte. I would like to give you my much mature overview that can actually inspire governments, universities, and the private sector, in which we are interested in exploring more and maturing this point of view more and more. As it was mentioned by Camila, we have a group of implementing urban policies in our municipalities, especially the obtention of resulting counterparties of private sector for the implementation of public policies. This instrument is a part of our guiding plan that's been implemented in 2020. I'm sorry, we can't see your presentation quite well. Can you do presentation mode, please?
Para mim aqui está em tela inteira. Deixa eu ver o que pode estar acontecendo. Para você não
For me
aparece?
here,
Não, pra gente
it's
tá daquele jeito
slide
do Zoom,
mode.
quando tem duas telas, sabe? A
Here
gente vê o seu próximo
we
slide junto.
have two
Deixa eu
screens.
tentar mudar o compartilhamento aqui, só um instante, por gentileza.
I'm going to change how I show my screen.
Deu certo agora?
Agora deu. Obrigada, desculpa.
Is it fine now? Yes.
Imagino, problema nenhum. Muito obrigado.
Yes, I'm sorry for the interruption. No
Então, a
problem.
gente inicia a nossa apresentação
So as we
com
mentioned,
dado sobre
we start our presentation
instrumento que foi
with
previsto pelo
information or
diretor, que é o
data
estoque de potencial
about the
construtivo adicional.
instrument
Quer dizer, a partir de
that's foreseen
2020,
in the
a cidade
guiding plan.
estabeleceu
Starting in
limite
2020, the
básico
city
de
established
aproveitamento do
a
terreno
limit,
fixado
a
em
basic
uma
limit
vez a área desse
of
mesmo terreno.
land
Então, a gente
use.
estabeleceu o coeficiente de
And
aproveitamento
once we
1 e acima
define that
dele,
area,
a
we establish
construção é
the
condicionada
coefficient
a
of
contrapartidas
use
ou
of land and
financeiras ou
condition
comportamentos
with
de
a condition
empreendedores
for a
privados
financial
que vão gerar
counterparty
algum tipo de
or the
benefício para a
behavior
cidade.
of private
Então,
entrepreneurs that going
em
to create
2020 foi
some type of
estabelecido
benefit for the city.
estoque de potencial construtivo adicional de quase
In 2020,
56 milhões de
they
metros quadrados,
established a stock
sendo
a
que até
potential
então,
constitution
até a data de
of
hoje,
almost 56
esse
square
potencial
meters
construtivo
that
adicional
up until
ele
today.
foi consumido
This
da ordem de
potential of
925
additional
mil metros
construction
quadrados,
are
cerca de
925 square
1,65% da
meters,
utilização total
close to
do estoque disponível. Então, a gente enxerga
1.65% of the
que existe
usage
ainda
rate
a
of the
possibilidade
available
de
stock.
incremento da
And here
densidades
we can
construtivas
see
na
the
cidade
possibility
a
of
partir do
increasing the needs
planejamento
of
urbanístico
construction in
do
the
plano
city
diretor.
from
E
the
aí, uma
urban
das
planning
formas
in the
de
guiding plan.
acesso a esse estoque
One
de
of the
potencial
ways
construtivo
of having
adicional
access
é a
to this type
utilização da
of
outorga
additional
onerosa do
construction
direito de
stock
construir,
is the
que é uma
usage
contrapartida financeira destinada a dois fundos
of
municipais.
the
Um
guarantees
fundo
or
municipal,
the
ele é exclusivamente
guarantee
destinado à
of the
produção de habitação
construction
social, que é o Fundo Municipal de
allocated
Habitação Popular,
to everything that has to
e
do
ele
with social
totalizou
housing and
entre
totaled
2020 e 2026
between
cerca de
2020 and
18 milhões de
2025
dólares de
totaled around
arrecadação, ao passo que
$18
o outro
million
fundo que
in
arrecada
collection.
a outorga onerosa
At the
do
same time, there was
direito de
another fund
construir
that
é o fundo de
collected
centralidades. Ele tem o objetivo
a
de
contribution, which is the
melhorar o
centralized fund.
equilíbrio entre
It has the objective
residência e
of improving
atividade
the balance
econômica na periferia da cidade. E esse fundo,
of everything that has to do with economic
destinado a
resilience
promover
in the
investimento
periphery of the
nas
city,
ruas do
the outskirts of the
comércio,
city.
nos centros
This fund
dos
is
bairros,
allocated for
de modo
investment
que as
everything that has to do
pessoas
with
precisem de
trade
menos
in
de
the
ir ao centro da
neighborhoods in
cidade
such a
para
way that
resolver as
people
suas
will need
atividades principais.
less to go
Então, esse
downtown to
fundo
solve their
tem esse
main
objetivo de
activities of the
requalificação
day.
dos centros dos
This
bairros
fund
e ele
has an
arrecadou
objective of categorizing
aproximadamente
neighborhoods
30 milhões de
and
dólares nos
collected,
últimos anos,
close
com
to
destaque de
$30
que a maior
million over the
fonte de
last
receita
years.
para esse fundo não foi a
And we
outorga
need to
onerosa
highlight
do
something
direito de
that the
construir,
source of
mas
income
a
of this fund
cobrança por
was not
acréscimos
the
irregulares que
onerous rates,
foram realizados
but the
nos
collection
empreendimentos privados
by
e que resultam numa
irregular
cobrança
appraisals
feita
that
pelo
were
município para
done from the private sector that
regularização
translated
desses
into a
acréscimos
collection
irregulares.
that's
Então,
done
a fonte
from the city
do Fundo
to
Municipal de
obviously
Habitação
regularize
Popular é a outorga
irregular
onerosa do direito
rent.
de construir, cobrada principalmente na área central, nas áreas mais nobres da cidade de Belo
This
Horizonte.
was collected
Portanto, ela
in the
tem uma arrecadação
central
muito
part
mais
of
expressiva do que a
this new
arrecadação
space, the much
das áreas de
more expressive
centralidade
in the collection of
que
these decentralized areas
vertem recursos ou destinam
that
recursos para
pours
esse
resources,
fundo
allocate
de
resources
centralidades.
for
Explicando
that
rapidamente,
decentralized
as
fund. So,
centralidades, como eu disse, são as ruas
centrally,
nos
as it
centros de
says, for
comércios
example, in
dos
the
bairros
streets,
periféricos que não estão na área
and
central
small
da
businesses
cidade de
in
Belo
peripheral
Horizonte.
neighborhoods that are not part of downtown Belo Horizonte. So the resources of the FMPH originated as a cause of EDC are allocated exclusively to housing, social housing programs in accordance to Article 143 of the Guiding Plan. The total invested in the period of 2024-2026, it reaches 20.1 million Brazilian reals or $4 million. And close to $5 million actually. We also have some investments that were made in everything that has to do with the fund of centrality. Today, the municipality of Belo Horizonte has a partnership with the NUPS structures that are part of the UN division of projects. We allocated 104 million reals to carry out these projects and the projects in the centralized areas to try to balance the dynamics of this work of housing. A third instrument, a second instrument that we put into the guiding plan. There's a couple of reflections. I'm going to take a step back to clarify something about how these instruments work in Belo Horizonte. We have financial counterparties that are provided by real estate companies. And these financial counterparties are basically some kind of behaviors that are executed directly by real estate companies so that they can receive the additional potential construction. One of those possibilities is the housing production, low-income housing, basically. So this plan was established in the guiding plan, and producing obviously that's, for example, is less than 1.5 minimum wages as part of the Constitution of Brazil, and the potential construction to be allocated in other places of the city. So it happens that this low gap of income is really difficult to take care in the market because it depends quite a lot on the direct production that public management brings here, and obviously instruments that are applicable for the benefit for the production of social housing for these families. Also, we work with the hypothesis of the cash flow for these entrepreneurships, because it's a benefit that is only received with the delivery of these houses once they're already built, starting the visibility status of the entrepreneurship, so it can be much more profitable. And a third hypothesis of lack of knowledge by real estate companies, lack of information of the instrument, for example, to visibilize the construction of houses or social housing. Here we have some specific zones for social housing that have as an objective to receive these entrepreneurships. Actually, Belo Horizonte is in a very complex metropolitan region. Here in Belo Horizonte, we have close to 2.3 million inhabitants. The metropolitan region has 6.5 million inhabitants. So what happens over the last few years is a scale of production of the economic pattern of low-income families. The cities that are on the outskirts of the metropolitan area, some of the cities that are borderline with Belo Horizonte, they have really expressive building areas, and as with areas, the special areas of social interest, it grows by 50% of production, mainly affecting seeing a preference of the market. The market of production of these areas and the number of produced areas between 2024 and 2025. And obviously it goes over 2,000 units, and it's an instrument that was not used in the way that we would have liked to. To be honest, it was 70,000 housing units, and obviously this is useful for us to reflect upon the approach that we want to give this instrument. Another instrument that is also foreseen in our legislation, and that Camila mentioned it as well, is the Urban Convention of Social Interest, in which the public power contributes the grant or gives us the grant, and subset buy habitational units. Obviously, it can be either or swap them, basically to use it in properties of low income, or for social uses. In this specific case, we have 3 allocation processes that were not successful, but we were able to identify the things that were failing, and we were able to reformulate based upon these issues, the hiring of this social interest housing. We don't see with good eyes a huge potential of housing, and we need to see the huge offering instruments that can be more powerful of national production, for example, for social housing with public and private partnerships that involve contract with volume, for example, to something that's compared to specific territories for public properties. Besides this, we need to say that the performance of Belo Horizonte is really good in the transfer potential and different neighborhoods. For example, this potential is being applied in the city for a long time with really effective results. Actually, 80% of properties that are amazing. And over the last few years, we started doing that monitoring. And we located up until 53 properties that generate this potential, with the owners of these properties receiving a construction potential that they didn't have before, and then it's transferred to other entrepreneurships, thus generating resources so they can invest in the restoring all the different assets. You have 3 minutes left, Leonardo. I'm almost done, don't worry. On top of that, the application of this instrument for environmental preservation has been implemented, but we are not able to achieve a relevant result in this period. Throughout this period, there was no transfer of construction potential allocated to the preservation of environmental areas. Right now, we're having a discussion with the municipal councils for public policy and environment, so that we can redirect towards the Chamber of Council members of Belo Horizonte to review this instrument so that they can visualize the implementation of this municipal projects for the population, something that was not done up until now. So we have this instrument that works, for example, for culture heritage, but that doesn't work for parks and areas of environmental preservation. So this needs maturity and reflection on our end about the adjustment of costs of these projects. On the other hand, we also have Innovate with the application of public policy and the networks very sensitive with urban growth. We have really positive results. Today, actually, we were able to increase the licenses of housing units into areas of preferential occupation and centrality that are located in downtown Belo Horizonte, and there's a greater infrastructure that are especially directed to us, with the possibility of applying instruments of access for additional construction potential more or closer to these places. And obviously this has played an important role in taking the market towards the equation or this project to areas that are a part of port areas from the point of view of infrastructure. But now we will need to move to the indication of the value and how to improve them in our city, so that we can have a more compact and dense city in its main centers in everything that has to do with its centrality. We have indicators that report the units, the housing units that are being produced, and we need to broaden that produced volume. And I believe that this is a critical moment in everything that has to do with this production, exactly because of the metropolis has behaved in a predictable way for the city. For example, every important city as Belo Horizonte has lost part of its production, especially in everything that has to do with social housing and everything that has to do with borderline cities. So within this urban policy instrument that have land use as its space and allow access to additional potential, positive potential, we presented to the municipal chamber a regeneration plan of the central area of Belo Horizonte, which is an area that had a population loss of more than 11% over the last few years, so that the market can actually act again in our territory and can harness the infrastructure that was built exactly or that was funded by the collectivity. Obviously, these are main, this is part of what happened in the city. And what happens today is that people are fleeing those areas. They're trying to use other territories that are underused, that become territories with construction potential, and obviously that they receive from the public power to exercise or implement the same area of the project, broadening the projects and allowing to have this, for example, in other capitals of the country. For example, they have in Sao Paulo, Fortaleza. And obviously everything has to do to take the population in different places of the city. And obviously, we have a lot of incentives to retrofit, social housing, exact, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Obrigada, Léo.
We are at your disposal,
Interessante
Camila.
de ver, né, que a
Thank you
gente
very
agora
much.
vê na
Leonardo, it's really
prática
interesting
como os
to see
instrumentos, não é um instrumento só,
how
são
we
muitos,
are in
né? E a
practice
importância também
and
do
how this
monitoramento desses
instruments
instrumentos e
and
da
the
avaliação do
importance
que a gente,
of monitoring of
do que está
these
escrito na lei
instruments
e
and these
como esses
assessments,
instrumentos são percebidos
because
pelo mercado, tem uma
as you have
distância
mentioned,
grande
and
e
how
eu
they're
vejo que vocês
perceived
estão
and
aí
these documents are
fazendo
absorbed
bom
and these instruments are
trabalho,
used in the
parabéns.
market. Obviously,
E boa
this
sorte
creates
que
something really
todos
big for
esses,
us.
né, esse
I think
conjunto de dados
we
que vocês têm sirvam
this sounds really
para
good, and I wish you the best luck in the
ajustar e ir
world,
calibrando,
because
né,
this
essa
can be
cesta de
really
instrumentos, que uma
important
outra
to
proposta que a
adjust
gente
and
sempre fez,
calibrate
um instrumento não pode
that basket
canibalizar
of instruments that
o
we
outro.
sometimes need.
Nessa linha de instrumentos,
That as
mecanismos
instruments can
articulados, a gente vai
cannibalize the
passar
other
agora a
or
mudar
obliterate
de
it, basically.
contexto, a gente vai para
So
Luján
here,
de
basically, we're
Cuyo, que
going to
está
change now the
na
context, and now
região
we are going
de
to
Mendoza, na
talk
Argentina. É
with the
município
region
de
of
porte intermediário
Mendoza,
que cresceu
Argentina,
43% na última,
which is a
nos últimos
municipality
10 anos.
that grew between
E
30 to
o
40%
que
over
a
the last
expansão
10
urbana
years.
compete com a atividade agrícola especificamente, né, com a viticultura,
And obviously, the
por
urban
recursos
context
hídricos
competes
em
with
declínio. A
agricultural
resposta que a gente
activities.
tem até agora, né,
So
foi o instrumento da articulação de
they're
vários
competing for
mecanismos
these high
coordenados
water resources
de
that are
gestão da
declining. So this
valorização
conversation
urbana que
has
vão
to
para um
do
fundo
with the coordinated
fiduciário
mechanisms
orientado
of
por
urban
índice de
management that
prioridade
go
de
towards
urbanismo
the
sustentável.
fiduciary fund
Então,
guided by an index
a
of
gente
properties
eu estou
and
super
sustainable
curiosa para
urbanism.
ouvir, né, dessa experiência
So
diretamente do
I
Leonardo
am really
Pinelli,
curious about hearing about the
que é
experiences,
analista de planejamento
their
estratégico
experiences
da
with
Prefeitura
Leonardo,
de Luján de Cuyo, onde
and
atua na
obviously
intersecção de dados, planejamento territorial,
the
inovação
mayor's
urbana.
office
O nosso segundo
of
Leonardo do painel é arquiteto
of
formado
his
pela
city in
Universidade
Argentina, the
Nacional
Luján
de
de
Cuyo.
Cuyo. He's an
Atualmente cursa
architect
mestrado na
graduated from
Politécnica
National
onde à frente
University,
já é
and
docente.
he has a master's
Foi uma
degree
disputa-chave no desenho
where
e na
he
operação de
obviously
sistemas de recuperação de
he's also
valorização
a
urbana
professor.
e do
He is
Fundo
a specialist
Fiduciário
in
que
design and
funciona
validation of systems.
em um caso de transferência. Então,
All
obrigada
the
pela
fund.
presença, Leonardo, e a palavra é sua.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Leonardo, for being here with us. And take it away. Go ahead. Thank you.
Ya vemos la pantalla.
Hola, ¿qué tal? ¿Ahora se escucha?
Sí,
Sí, se
adelante.
escucha bien.
Perfecto.
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Como bien dijo Camila, es
Well,
Benesi.
my name is Gerardo Benesi. I'm an architect, and I study the Master in Urban Economy. I worked in Luján de Cuyo in Mendoza in coordinating strategic planning.
Cuando hablamos de Luján de Cuyo,
When we speak of Luján de Cuyo, we're speaking about a department which is in the province of Mendoza, in the west of Argentina, on the border with Chile. It's important to highlight that it has population has grown about 46%. Is one of the fastest growing municipalities in the or province in the region. It's a department with 4,800 square kilometers, so it's about more than 20 times the size of the city of Buenos Aires. Our province, the water resource is the fundamental resource because it's very scarce and it's getting scarcer every year. By 2050, the supply will be smaller than demand, and there's a projected drought. Another important aspect is that our department is in a very strategic position because we have the transoceanic highway from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. So it's also very strategic. So some facts is that it's a very dispersed city. If you see it from a bird's view, it's you see low buildings, very spread across a large territory, and the city is expanding. We have an intrinsic problem, which is we are losing water, which is very valuable for us. 35% of the water is basically being lost from the water comes until the end point of the end use. So we know that the longer the water network, more losses we're going to have. So that is why, and in addition to the impacts of such a city like transportation, pollution, etc., our purpose is to streamline the city so we don't lose as much water. One of the problems when we generate a compact city is the lack of financing. We want to generate a compact city, but also we don't have the funds for it. This is why we are proposing the solution, is that when the state invests in infrastructure demanded by this compact city, we know that the land we will be adding value to the land, to the surrounding territory, and this value capture will be financed with through an urban trust fund. So we developed the infrastructure of the cities, of the system, which is a land fund, which is basically an administration of the state-owned lands. This was very dispersed, spread out throughout the territory, and the information was not denominated as such, as a land fund. We developed an urban fund, which is a different fund, apart from the regular budget. And the input to these funds, we lost the audio. There it is. And the idea is for us to transcend. Sorry, Leonardo, we're losing you. So we are generating we want to have a solid financial structure regardless of the government. The coordinated instruments that we are generating or that we are proposing is a contribution based or fees based on betterment, so property betterment.
y está flexible.
Sorry, we're losing the audio.
Leonardo, quizás puedes
Leonardo, sorry.
apagar tu cámara para
Can
ver mejor la
you
transmisión.
turn your camera
Es que
off to see your
estamos
connection improves?
cortados.
Because we're coming through a bit choppy.
¿Se escucha?
Can you hear me now?
Sí, pero se corta mucho, por eso
It's coming
sugiero que
through a bit
apagues
choppy. So try
eso.
to maybe turn your camera off.
¿Mejor ahí?
Is it better?
Sí, dale.
I think so, yes. Please go ahead.
Tenemos 6 instrumentos coordinados que
So
alimentan
we
el
have
mismo fondo, un
6
mismo fondo.
coordinated
Estos son contribución
instruments,
provisional, como dijimos anteriormente.
betterment charges, as we mentioned
Participación
before,
en la valorización activa de
then
instrumentos.
participation in
Sobre
active
tasa de precio sobre
value
ingresos totales,
adding,
como le dicen
then
generalmente,
a
en
surcharge
Latinoamérica.
on
Derecho de construcción adicional, el cual se
facilities
plantea en
or
la línea
property that is
base,
not
en
being
una línea
used.
sobre esa línea base.
Then we have a special
Y cesión en
contribution
el
to
gasto de
contribute
equipamiento.
to the
Esto,
development
en
of
esto
water
se
supply
encuentra.
and
La escuela
sanitation
existía,
networks.
los grandes loteos tienen que ceder equipamiento al municipio, a los
And
espacios de equipamiento o terrenos.
equipment assignment. Large properties sometimes needs to contribute also with equipment.
¿Dónde invertir?
So where to invest?
Esto hemos generado un índice de ciudad
We have
deseada,
developed
en donde lo
an
que es
index.
donde se
We call
invierte
it the
el dinero
desired
que se junta en el
city
fondo,
index.
no lo decide la dirección
So
política,
basically,
sino un
this should
índice
not
de
be
ciudad
decided by
deseada.
political
Nosotros
leadership,
hemos generado
but
distintos
by the index
indicadores
itself.
en
So
el
we have
cual
developed a series of
podemos
indicators
clasificar
where we
nuestra
can
ciudad, los habitantes
classify
de la ciudad,
our
con
cities, the different
letras de
districts
la
in the
A
city, with
a la
letters
E, y
from
sabemos
A
cuáles
to
están
E, so we know which ones
cuáles
are
tienen mejor valorización y cuáles tienen menor valorización.
which
Lo
have the
importante de
greatest
esto
value and the least
es
value.
que capturamos
So the idea for
valor en
this
las zonas que tienen
is to
mayor
capture
valorización
value
y las
in
que van a
areas
las
with
zonas que tienen menor
highest
valorización. Es
values.
una transferencia
So to
directa de
transfer
recursos
them
entre
to
zonas más ricas y
lower
las zonas
value.
más
So
pobres.
basically a transfer of wealth from the richest area to the
¿Cómo logramos nosotros
areas with fewer resources. So how do we
esta planificación con el índice?
So
Tenemos
how do we
instrumentos,
achieve
tenemos un
this
tablero
planning
digital
with the index?
que
We
nos
have
permite
a
simular antes de
digital tool
invertir.
that allows us to
Nosotros
simulate
sabemos
before we invest.
en dónde están nuestros espacios
We
verdes, por
know
ejemplo,
where
y
our
podemos
green
simular
areas, for
distintos
example,
escenarios de dónde
are, and we
colocar
can
esos
develop
espacios
different
verdes
scenarios on
y
where to
automáticamente
develop green areas, and then
el programa nos
automatically the
sugiere cuál es la
program
mejor
will
decisión,
infer
el
what
mejor
is the
escenario
best decision, the
de
best
inversión
scenario
para seguir
for
promoviendo de la
investment,
mejor manera
so we
el
can
índice.
promote the
Además,
index
esta
in a better
herramienta
way.
permite transparencia en tiempo
So
real.
these tools
Cualquier
allows
vecino
for
puede ver
real-time
cómo está
transparency
el
because
índice de ciudad
any
deseada.
resident can actually access this index.
Por último, voy a mencionar unas 5
Then I'm going
obras
to mention 5
que se han
specific
realizado
projects
últimamente.
that have been developed
Tenemos el
recently.
Parque Solar Municipal,
We have the
que es un parque
municipal
solar
solar park.
que le da energía específicamente a
This
las plantas de
solar
agua
park
potabilizadoras.
provides
Tenemos
energy for the water treatment plant. We lost the audio, sorry.
Tal vez podemos ayudar compartiendo nosotros la pantalla para poder, a ver si Leonardo
I don't
tiene
know,
la
maybe if
cámara
we
ahí, si
share the
pueden
screen
enviar el
on our
audio.
end, then maybe Leonardo's connection may improve.
Creo que lo perdimos, Camila.
I think we lost him, Camila.
Sí. No sé si pasamos a Leonardo Castro, que tiene varias preguntas en el
Or
chat.
maybe we
en
move
este
on to
instante.
some of the questions on the chat
Sí,
for
tenemos 3 minutos para ir cerrando, así que tal vez
Leonardo.
entonces,
Yes, we
sí,
have
vamos.
just
No,
3
vamos a
minutes
hacer
before the end of the
preguntas
session, so
y
maybe
también
we can just address a
invitarlos
couple of questions and then
compartir en el chat. En el chat
invite you
tenemos
to
muchísimas
share on the
preguntas el
chat
día de
because we
hoy.
have a lot of questions
Invitarlos
today.
a contestar las
So
preguntas también a nuestros panelistas allí
maybe invite our
en el
panelists to
chat.
answer some of the questions if the
Y
question
creo
is
que podemos
addressed to
tomar un
you.
par de preguntas, Camila.
Yeah, maybe let's take a couple of questions
Ok.
to wrap up.
No sé si Leonardo Castro.
Leonardo Castro.
Se você revisou algumas das perguntas no chat, quer responder por aqui?
Leonardo, maybe were you
Pode
able to,
colocar.
did you get a chance to check some of the
Eu vinha
questions
lendo aqui,
on
eu
the
já tinha
chat?
respondido duas pelo chat, mas eu
Well,
posso, deixa eu ver as que eu já respondi, que
I
aí
had already
fica mais
answered a couple of
fácil.
questions on the chat. Let me see if there are some new
Primeiro,
questions.
o professor José Rezenezito
So,
Ribeiro, doutorando em Economia da Fundação Getúlio Vargas, ele
Professor
pede uma
Jose
explicação do que
Rivero
teria causado
from the
o
Getúlio
aumento da
Vargas
arrecadação
Foundation
do
wants
Fundo de
an
Centralidades em
explanation
Belo
on what
Horizonte.
caused
E aí
the
eu respondi
increase
também
in
no
the
chat
collection
explicando
in
que
Belo Horizonte.
nós temos duas
And I
dinâmicas
answered
muito
on the chat
próprias na
explaining
cidade em
that we
relação à
have
arrecadação
two
da outorga
basically
onerosa que
specific
nós temos que
dynamics
construir. Uma
on
que acontece
collection
no que é o perímetro original
for
da cidade. Nós
the
temos aqui a Avenida do Contorno, que é
assignment of
a
rights. And
cidade que
one
foi
has to do with the
planejada em
perimeter of the city. We
1897.
have
Essa
the
área é a área mais
surrounding
rica da
avenue, which
cidade,
is
mais pujante do
the
ponto de
city
vista
planned
imobiliário.
in
E aqui
1927. This is
a
a,
outorga onerosa
a
ela é arrecadada
bustling,
e esses
booming part of
recursos
the
vão para o
city.
fundo de habitação,
And
que é destinado a
here,
financiar a habitação
this
social.
special
O
tax
fundo de
is used
centralidades
for
ele
a
visa seguir
housing
principalmente
fund
recursos
for
da regularização de
social
imóveis
interest
aqui, né? Que são em São Paulo
housing.
costuma se chamar de lei de anistia, né?
So,
Então esse
in
recurso
Sao
se
Paulo is
paga por
known as the
acréscimos
amnesty law.
irregulares. Então a outorga onerosa
This
não tem um
specific
papel
fund that is
muito
paid
expressivo no fundo de centralidades. E a explicação para esse aumento é
windfall
exatamente porque
profits,
nós
and
aumentamos as
the
cobranças sobre a
explanation for
viabilização de
this
acréscimos
spike in
irregulares,
collection
e
is
isso
that
tem
we increased the
contribuído aí
rate
para
for
o
this
fundo
specific budget for
habitacional do fundo de
inclusionary housing.
centralidades.
And this has helped
O
this
Vitor Carvalho
centralization,
Preto,
the housing
querido
fund.
amigo, faz uma
And
pergunta aqui. Quais são
also,
as maiores
Carvalho Preto
dificuldades
was
na
also asking questions on
implementação dos
how
novos instrumentos
were the main
dinâmicos em Belo Horizonte,
difficulties
como tem sido
of the different
superado?
projects in Belo Horizonte, and
Eu
how were
considero
they
que, primeiro,
developed.
assim, a gente tem a parte mais
First,
difícil é regulamentar, né? A parte mais difícil
the most
é
important part,
habilitar
or
esses
most difficult part, is
instrumentos
to
para
regulate
que eles comecem a rodar.
and enable these sort of
E em
instruments so they
seguida
can
disso, eu acho
start
que a gente tem esse desafio da
being
metrópole, né? De
applied.
como
And we
as
have also
cidades
a
no entorno
challenge
de
of
Belo Horizonte,
the
a maior parte
metropolis,
delas, eu diria
how
quase
the cities in
todas
the
elas não
outskirts in Belo
regulamentaram
Horizonte,
esses instrumentos. A gente vive numa cidade
because most cities
metropolitana
did
que
not
não
really
reconhece os
regulate
limites do
this
município.
sort of
A gente
instruments.
estabelece uma regulação
We live in a
muito
metropolitan
avançada,
cities does not
mas
really
isso não se
respect any
reflete necessariamente
formal
na
boundaries of the
arrecadação, isso não
city.
se reflete
And this is not really
necessariamente numa
reflected
boa
on
aplicação dos
tax
instrumentos
collection.
aqui, porque isso
And
acaba
this is not
gerando a
reflected
fuga de
on
alguns tipos
proper implementation of the
empreendimentos das
instruments.
cidades que
So
ainda
I
não
think
fazem a captura de
this
mais-valias. Então, eu considero que
actually makes
a
projects move to
assimetria
different cities.
entre a cidade de
So I
Paulo e as
think
cidades que estão no
the
entorno de
asymmetry
Belo Horizonte,
between
talvez hoje tenha sido o maior desafio que a
this
gente
type of
enfrenta.
city and the cities within
Obrigada,
Belo
Léo.
Horizonte, I think it is one of the main challenges that we have.
A gente vai encerrar
Thank
agora. Uma
you.
pena
Thank you,
que
Leo.
a apresentação que a gente teve
So we have to
péssima
conclude. It's a
com
shame that
Ahí
we
conectó otra
have
vez y
this
no sé por
technical
qué se
difficulty
estaba
with
muriendo.
Leonardo Penesi.
pero seguimos con
No,
cortes.
ya tenemos que cerrar, Leonardo. Si
So we have
quisieras
to
dar
adjourn
como
the
la frase
session,
final
but
para
maybe
poder
some
cerrar, porque ya el
final
tiempo se nos terminó.
conclusion because we
Sí,
ran out of
perfecto.
time, unfortunately.
No, para
Yeah.
cerrar, quería
Well, just to wrap
comentarles
up, I just wanted
que la
to
ciudad intermedia
say
se
that
puede realizar, que es
this type of
posible
city
muy
is
similar a
possible.
Brasil, que es el caso
You see, for example,
de
cases like in
Venecia, que es
Brazil,
de capturar
which
el
is
enriquecimiento del suelo, pero en Argentina también se
it's a
puede.
role
Estamos
model
empezando
in
desde cero con
funds
una ciudad
collection,
intermedia.
in
Es
value
mucha
capture,
paciencia,
but
como
we're starting with
preguntarle a los
Brazil,
chicos,
with an
explicar lo que se
intermediate
quiere hacer,
size
convencer
city. It's difficult. It's difficult to convince everyone what we want to do,
a todos y se logra hacer.
but it is possible.
Obrigada, Leonardo. Essa ótima
Thank you.
mensagem pra
Thank
gente
you,
encerrar também,
Leonardo.
que a gente consegue fazer,
Thank you
consegue
for
fazer
that
diferente em cada
message. It was
contexto,
a
né? Não é para ficar
wonderful
repetindo
presentation,
fórmulas,
wonderful message, and how we
mas a
can
gente conseguir
adapt and do
ter
something
um
different.
panorama, né, de
And
experiências
here we
que
can have
nunca acaba,
a
né?
whole
Sempre
array
enriquece e acho que
of
aprender com as
experiences. And this is a
experiências e
never-ending task.
seguir
And I think we need to learn from
monitorando
experiences
o mercado
and continue
imobiliário urbano,
monitoring the
entender
market,
como esses
the real
instrumentos
estate
incidem,
urban market,
é
to see
fundamental
how these
para a
instruments
gente
can actually
combater aquilo
influence our
que
action. I
eu
think this
falei no
is
começo, que é talvez
this
dos
is
maiores, ou
paramount
pelo menos é o que a gente
in
pode
our
enfrentar
fight against
com
these
essa
problems and
prática
these
de
obstacles.
conhecimento, a ignorância. Então,
which is a lack of knowledge about this instrument. So, Maria Camila, thank you again for this session, for allowing me to moderate. It was a real pleasure to share the morning with you. And I'll give you the floor so you could just adjourn our seminar. Thank you very much. Thank you, Cynthia, Minji, Leonardo, both Leonardos with the cases of Belo Horizonte and Luján. I think the panel gives us some clear ideas, starting with tax or fiscal limitations. The cities need to find new ways of funding, and they need to learn to mobilize value that they generate through urban regulation, through public investment, and through land management. I think this is a very important message in today's conversation. Cynthia was explaining about the gap, that the gap is not really in the absence of instruments, but in the difficulty in cities to apply them, to implement them effectively. And I think we've seen cases, very specific cases today. Cynthia was also explaining that for many cities to start out with the right foot is more important than starting with a highly sophisticated instrument. So the important thing is to use simple tools that allow cities to build capacities. So I think that has been the general message of all the panelists today. Minji was reminding us of a very basic principle, powerful principle, is that when public action increases value, land value, a part of that value should go back to the city and not remain just on the property owners. She explained the case of Boston, how those instruments are actually combined to improve infrastructure as part of one central strategy. I think the very specific cases of Belo Horizonte and Luján de Cuyo in Argentina showed how these instruments function in practice, what are the challenges, and that this is not an automatic process. We need to work on this, and this is a step-by-step process. One of the lessons I think that is important to draw here is that these instruments, land management instruments, open a pathway for financing when they are integrated within a clear urban strategy and urban policy to tackle different challenges. We have a great opportunity to manage our land in a better way and to add value for our cities. So we've heard very important messages in today's conversation. Before we say goodbye, just three key messages. One is to ask for your support to evaluate today's session. You can see on the screen. You have the link also on the chat, so you can make an evaluation of today's seminar. Remember that the lessons or the sessions are on our YouTube channel, and also to adjourn this series of webinars. And thank you, all the moderators and all the panelists who joined us today and the last couple of weeks. This first series, we will see each other again in June with a new series on urban productivity. So be on the lookout for our newsletter so you don't miss the dates. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today from your cities. See you next time.